Good morning from our global headquarters in New York. I'm Manus Craney. You're welcome to Bloomberg Brief. Let's set your agenda. Get ready for an economic lullapalooza. Scott Bessent is appointed as Treasury Secretary. Close to a deal, Israeli ambassador to the U.S. says a potential ceasefire with Hezbollah may be days away. All of that as we push ahead to the PCE later in the week, and a hint at the Fed's rate path. Good morning. What is an economic lullapalooza? Those are the words of Scott Bessent, the choice of President-elect for Treasury Secretary. We've been waiting and prevaricating about that. You thought about the Trump put frenzy. Well, it's now the Trump Bessent frenzy. He's talking about tax cuts, deregulation. We're building on a 1.7% rally in the S&P last week, and the small caps put on 4.5% last week. Firing ahead this morning. There's a boom time to come in the USA, and Scott Bessent wants to be part of that narrative. The bond market likes what it hears. It is a fiscal hawk in the nominee for Treasury Secretary. He's talking about the power of the threes. Never mind Shinzo Abe's three arrows. It's the Bessent threes, the budget deficit of 3% by 2028. And is he the guardrail in the room on the extremity of tariffs that President-elect Trump may well want to exert? Whatever way you look at it, ground zero for the reaction function, not just in equities, but also in the FX market. The longest rally in the dollar breaks. Is Bessent, as they say, the safe pair of hands? Does he puncture the angst in regard to that massively strong dollar? The longest rally that we've seen in a year, up for 8 weeks in a row. We start on the back foot, and as you can see, a relief in the euro bouncing from its two-year low, and the pound up by a third of 1%. As I've just said, President-elect Donald Trump has chosen his Treasury Secretary. The markets have voted favorably on the news as far as stocks and bonds are concerned, less so to Bitcoin, indeed, and a few other assets. But what is on the agenda? Well, according to the Wall Street Journal, he says that the dollar will remain the reserve currency. He thinks we should all prepare for an economic lullapalooza, thanks to the Trump tax cuts and deregulation. And he envisaged some kind of grand economic reordering, and now he gets to be a part of it. Joining me now is Seema Shah, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management. Seema, good morning. The markets, equity markets and bond markets, like what they hear. Are you ready for an economic lullapalooza? Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, look, I think it's right that the market is receiving this fairly well. You know, over the last week or two, what we've seen is an unwinding a little bit of the Trump trade, but more because of concerns around some of the extremes of the policies. You know, what would be the inflationary impact of tariffs? What could happen to the fiscal deficit? So I think this nomination is really good news in that it takes away some of those tail risks and really sets path back for the US economy onto something which is really, really strong growth, but also good news for the rest of the world too. So overall, I think this is certainly very positive.
The power of the threes, I mean, it's a reaffirmation of policy indication from Bessent that we've heard before. 3% on the deficit, 3% from deregulation in terms of growth that you achieve, and 3 million barrels of oil. I don't know where they're going to get the 3 million barrels of oil from. But in regards to that deficit narrative and this cost-cutting narrative, if you could join that with Doge, is disinflation a word we should begin to parlay a little bit more 2025 versus a resurgence of inflation?
Well, I think at least we can stop worrying so much about the idea that there could be an inflation resurgence, a second wave. I think what we're seeing now, though, is that the market is just reasserting, or at least returning to focusing on what the fundamentals were pre-election and continue to be in play post-election, which is still strong growth. So from that regard, I think the inflation risk is probably still present, but at least from a more healthy level, just saying, well, look, the labour market is still really resilient. So how much more disinflation are you realistically going to get at this kind of level of growth? So I think it's about fundamentals rather than just about what policy risks that could be for the future. Look,
you do put a very clear warning out there, which is this rally, this Trump put, and now the Trump Bessent put, so to speak, has been infused again in equity markets. That will run. We're risk on at the moment. But you do have a warning that some of this exuberance may be challenged at the end of the first quarter in 2025. What is the biggest challenge to that, Seema?
Well, I think there's two. One is, of course, valuations. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a correction, but it does give a bit of a speed limit. So a question mark about how much equities can rally from here. The other side of it is, you know, as we were talking before, it was really around inflation. You know, what's going to happen to inflation? Are you going to see this continuation of very strong growth, that no landing scenario, which then means that inflation doesn't come down and then results in the Fed becoming a little bit more hawkish interest rates not coming down as much as the market had been hoping for. And then that starts to play into a slightly more negative story. But overall, certainly the outlook for 2025 is one of optimism and positivity, but we just don't think that returns are going to be anything like what we saw in 2024.
Okay, so maybe not those outsized animal spirits of return. But I like the way that you craft the narrative for the Fed. You say it starts with a pivot. A lot of people have pushed back at me in terms of suggesting that we're on the roadmap to a pause. But you say it starts with a pivot, has evolved at the central bank, but it turns into a swerve. Now that's a lovely way to reflect on it. What's the swerve?
So look, as we get to, we do think there's going to be a cut in the December meeting. Once you get into January, I think the Fed, we've already heard from them a number of times in the last couple of weeks, really recognizing that growth continues to be very strong, but also the fact that actually inflation is no longer decelerating. That last mile is proving to be as stubborn as some people had been warning about earlier this year. So from a Fed perspective, actually the need for consecutive rate cuts starts to diminish. So we certainly think that there's a very high chance that they will move to a more gradual pace of rate cuts. So that means missing out on every other meeting. So you still do move rates lower. We don't think that there's no more rate cuts to come after the end of this year, but you are moving at a slow pace. And of course, if the economy does prove to be as strong as what we're seeing today, there is little need for them to cut rates as much as I think had been priced into the market earlier in the year. So that 3.5% level may be a bit of a stretch in the end.
Look, the reaction function this morning is most profound in the dollar. And it seems to be this moment of reflection. I mean, it's the longest run higher in 2 years. The weekly gains have been pretty significant. This suggests maybe the most extreme part of the tariff narrative. He may be the guardrail in the room. It's just too early to kind of fly that kite, is it?
It is quite early. I mean, we as we knew before, a lot of policy proposals, but it doesn't necessarily always translate into action. So we're still waiting to see. The news for Besson is good in that, maybe tariffs won't be as significant as had been feared. So therefore, the inflation risk isn't going to be maybe as pertinent. But we are still waiting to see. And with regards to US exceptionalism, which I think is what the dollar is really trading off, I think that still stands. That was in play before the election. It continues after the election. And it's really, again, it's down to fundamentals. US growth continues to be very strong. Whereas if you look out around the rest of the world, look at Europe, for example, China, there is real economic weakness. So on that basis alone, it does still call for US exceptionalism, which means a continued strong dollar. But I think that we have to recognize that the dollar is very, very expensive. So the chances of a further significant rally is quite constrained. And certainly with the idea that maybe tariffs won't be as significant as expected, that probably does pull out those high levels that people have been talking about for the dollar for next year.
Can we just round off with the equity narrative? The earnings per share, we're just closing off this third quarter. It's the strongest earnings per share growth since 2018. And what goes through my mind is what scale of corporate tax cuts are you going to need? What size and scale of tax cuts are you going to need to see to prolong that earnings per share narrative, Seema? If we've had 35 to 21, 21 to 15 is something materially different in terms of size and scale on corporate tax.
Well, look, we're not really expecting any major new tax cuts for next year. We're just thinking that it's going to be extension of those tax cuts. You just don't get that fiscal cliff coming through. So in that regard, it doesn't actually change. It doesn't create a change in the scenario just by having extension. And generally speaking, look, I think the earnings growth picture, as you said, is positive. It's really based on that strong growth. It's probably not going to move as strongly as we've seen before, but I don't think you necessarily need to see corporate tax cuts in order to keep a really strong economic growth narrative going for the US.
Okay, Seema, thank you very much. Seema Shah there, Principal Asset Management. First reaction to the Treasury selection of Scott Bessent by President Trump, the elect president. A little bit of breaking news for you on Blackstone now. And this is what we've got for you. Blackstone has struck a deal, $3.5 billion financing deal with the energy group EQT. Now, this is according to the Financial Times. Blackstone has agreed to buy the venture stake in the interstate pipelines from the U.S. energy group EQT. So it's a $1.1 trillion investment manager's first fast-growing credit insurance arm will finance this $3.5 billion transaction. It puts them head-to-head with Apollo in terms of this area. So we'll track that story through the morning. The headline, Blackstone to buy the JV with the interstate pipelines from EQT. There you go, EQT pre-market. Other stories trending on your Bloomberg terminal this Monday morning. This is what we got for you. UniCredit is launching a $10.6 billion all-share offer for the domestic rival Banco BPM. The acquisition will make UniCredit Italy's largest lender by assets and accelerate this year's wave of European bank merger activity. The Italian government hasn't yet commented on the proposed deal. Apple CEO Tim Cook is returning to China for at least the third time this year at the Suppliers Conference. The Chinese premier is expected to meet with the CEOs as the companies brace for President-elect Trump's threat to raise tariffs on Chinese goods. Cook was in the capital just last month when he promised to keep investing in the country. Anglo American said it's agreed to sell its steel-making coal business to Peabody Energy in a $3.78 billion deal. Anglo is looking to dramatically simplify and shrink the business, and restructure also involves exiting platinum and nickel mining. Coming up, get ready for an economic Lollapalooza. That's the words of the fund manager Scott Bessent. He is Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary. We'll dive into how he won the race. And Daragh Maher of HSBC joins me to talk through the dollar. Just how might it react, as it has done this morning, to Scott Bessent's nomination, right here on Bloomberg. It is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manus Cranny in New York. President-elect Donald Trump has named Brooke Rollins as head of the Trump Backing America First Policy Institute for Agriculture Secretary. That was yesterday. And the pick marks the end of a process of selecting his administration's top cabinet officials. But the pick that stands out from everything, it is the Treasury Secretary. And finally, Square Capital founder and CEO Scott Bessent was nominated. Joining me now, it is our chief political correspondent, Amri. Amri, great reporting on this throughout the whole of last week. Bessent won out, much, I would say, to the chagrin of maybe Elon Musk, if you can put it in that way. But he is the nomination. The markets are reacting really, really quite strongly. Their stocks, bonds, and FX. What can we expect?
Right. He's being welcomed by the markets, an individual that he's talked about. He wants to have this 3-point plan to cut the deficit, still have growth, expand U.S. energy that could potentially help in that pro-growth environment. And the markets are hailing him because this is someone that's very well versed in global financial systems around the world. But we should note that amongst all the other nominees, potential candidates as well, these were all top contenders of high caliber people, but it went to Scott Bessent. And the thing about Scott Bessent is he has been on the president's side throughout the entire campaign and has been a key economic advisor throughout the campaign. He was the front runner in the very beginning, and then throughout this whole 2-week soap opera, it went back to him in the end. So I think you're going to get a very pragmatic Treasury Secretary. I know a lot of individuals have pointed to some of his comments on tariffs. He might be this moderating voice on blanket tariffs, and he is going to make sure that he has his eye on the stock market and the $28 trillion U.S. Treasury market that he will be now overseeing, if confirmed.
Well, he is the global salesman for U.S. assets and the keeper of the dollar. There's a couple of lovely lines in the story. You talk about the 3 arrows in his quiver, as it were, for economic policy. But what happened to the other chess pieces that you so correctly suggested, which was Kevin Walsh and, of course, Rowan? Is there another chess piece to play with Walsh? Will he possibly end up at National Economic Council? Potentially. We'll have to wait and see. We do know that Kevin Walsh, formerly of the Fed, wants to go back and be the Fed chair. We do know that Jay Powell is up in 2026. Potentially, you could see Kevin Walsh at NEC to be the NEC director. That was a position that Larry Kudlow occupied during the first iteration of the Trump administration. A very vocal member of the team, an individual that works very closely with Treasury but sits in the West Wing and really does a lot of the economic liaison between Congress and some of the other institutions around the West Wing. Potentially
potentially he can go there for 2 years and then go to the Fed. But we have not yet got a nomination when it comes to the NEC. And there's other economic jobs we're waiting for as well. We need to know, of course, who's going to be the undersecretary and the deputy secretary when it comes to Treasury Department, but also who is going to lead the FTC, who's going to lead the SEC, and then Howard Lutnick, who really wanted the Treasury job but was nominated to do the Commerce Secretary position. When his announcement came, it talked about having a very much so a broader portfolio when it comes to trade and tariffs, even including, at least in this statement, talking about USTR filtering up through Howard Lutnick. But we still don't know who the USTR ambassador is going to be. That individual in the first iteration of Trump went to Ambassador Bob Lighthizer.
And there's also a presumption that to expand Lutnick's portfolio or power in his portfolio, it's going to take a little bit more of ratification from Congress. I do want to square off on one visit over the weekend. We understand that Mark Rutte visited Mar-a-Lago. Of course, Mark Rutte is the NATO Secretary General, the new NATO Secretary General. And the first words out of his mouth at one of the first press conferences was about ingratiating himself to Trump in terms of the pressure that he had exerted in the first administration on defense spending.
Well, I would say Mark Rutte sat down with us in Davos and talked about the fact that he, in his words, Trump was right when it came to the defense spending of other members of the alliance, of the NATO alliance, that he was right saying that the U.S. spends much more than everyone else. And if this is going to be a collective alliance, everyone needs to spend their 2%. He also, in this interview with us, had a great line. I think you basically see that playing out now in this idea of like raw economic power. He basically said, you know, we'll dance with whoever's on the dance floor with us. And that's, as he's the NATO Secretary General, that's going to be Donald Trump.
There's a lot of dancing at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend, celebrating finally the decision on who is the Treasury Secretary. Anne-Marie, great to have you with us this morning. You'll see Anne-Marie a little bit later on in Surveillance with the team. Let's cross to the Middle East now. Israel is potentially days away from a ceasefire with Hezbollah. That's according to the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. The proposal entails an initial 60-day suspension of hostilities, but still requires approval from the government. Jemana Besetchi joins us now. Jemana, good to see you this morning. So the details on this potential ceasefire, Emish Hochstein has been busy.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly the comments from the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. this morning are encouraging. He's saying, and this is a quote, it could happen within days. And as you mentioned, Amos Hochstein, the Middle East envoy, was just in the region last week having conversations with the Lebanese side and the Israeli side. He spoke to the Lebanese Speaker of the House, Nabi Habirri, who suggested that a ceasefire agreement has been accepted by Hezbollah, but with a few, quote, technical details. Now, it remains to be seen what exactly those technical details are, but definitely Amos Hochstein felt like he had enough in offering to go to the Israeli side. And we're hearing this morning from that ambassador that they potentially could come to a truce agreement in the next couple of days. Now, in terms of the details, as we're just showing there, it would involve a 60-day suspension of hostilities during which Hezbollah would have to retreat away from the border about 30 kilometers north of the border, north of the Litani River. The Lebanese army would then step in to oversee the proceedings in that part of the country alongside a UN peacekeeping force. And then there's one last element as well that Israel are insisting on, which is in case there are any infractions, they would still like to retain the capability to resume strikes on Lebanon in case that happens. And from what we know, that is not acceptable to the Lebanese side. So there's still a few details to be discussed, as I mentioned, but it certainly appears as though there is a massive push from the Biden administration to get this over the line, Manas.
Jemana, thank you very much. Jemana Besetchi there on the very latest prospects for ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. Coming up, flying high at the box office, we discuss how much Green Wicked made at the theatres this weekend after its marketing blitz. It's Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manish Krenny in New York. Front pages is what we've got for you, making headlines around the world. First up, New York Times. Immigrants in the U.S. are racing to get ahead of President-elect Trump's crackdown. He has vowed to slash immigration and ramp up deportations on day one. Foreign-born residents are taking whatever steps they can to protect themselves from the sweeping measures. Next up, Bloomberg leads with the charges against Adani. This may test President-elect Trump's desire to keep India close to the U.S. U.S. prosecutors have charged the Indian businessman Gautam Adani with a $250 million bribery scheme. This might bring the relationship between Trump and the PM Modi into question, but it remains unclear how Modi will look to distance himself from Adani. And the Journal? Well, the Journal leads with Wicked, defying gravity at the box office, with fans flocking to the theatres, sporting whatever colour they can get their hands on, pink and green. The musical's film adaptation brought in $114 million over the opening weekend, setting up for a long run through the holidays. The weekend's other new release, Gladiator 2, pulled in $55.5 million. There you go. Have you got your pink and your green ready to rock and roll? I've got people that are going to see that twice. There you go. That'll add to the numbers. Leave you with a snapshot of Bitcoin. It's still reflected glory. From our global headquarters in New York, welcome to Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manish Cranny. Let's set your agenda. Get ready for an economic lollapalooza. Scott Bessent is appointed as Treasury Secretary. Close to a deal. Israeli ambassador to the U.S. says a potential ceasefire with Hezbollah may be days away. All of that as we push ahead to the PCE data later this week for a hint of the Fed's rate path. Good morning. The markets are rejoicing, not just a Trump put, but the Trump Bessent put. It is on fire. Look at those small caps adding to their 4.5% rally that you saw last week. This is boom time in the USA. You're getting ready for this economic lollapalooza that Bessent promises in the Wall Street Journal. Roll it over, have a look at the bonds, because the bonds are reflecting on a fiscal hawk nominee. That's essentially what you've got here. 4.33. You saw PIMCO say you want to get in and buy those bonds at 4.5 to 4.45 to 4.5% last week. Well, we're down 6 basis points this morning. The threes from Bessent, and one of those is the budget deficit to 3% by 2028. We need to understand what fiscal hawk really means from Bessent in terms of, are the worst of the tariff, or the extremes of the tariffs, perhaps guard-rated? Roll it over, have a look. By the way, you've got $183 billion worth of twos, fives and tens coming to the market this week. The dollar steps back this morning. There's a global reflection moment in the FX market. You've just broken the longest weekly rally in a year. Is Bessent the safe pair of hands that punctures the angst in regards to the worst of the tariffs? So the dollar drops by 0.5%. The euro bounces from its 2-year low. And, of course, the sterling gets a little bit of a relief. As I say, ready yourself for a lollapalooza. That is on the agenda now, that according to the President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Before the election, Bessent spoke to Bloomberg TV about how he envisions Trump's policies affecting the economy. Here's what his view was on the dollar. Let's take a listen.
We could see what's called the dollar smile, which you start out, right now we have high interest rates, high deficit. If you were to get inflation down to or below target through deregulation, through energy, then interest rates could come down, and you would have a market-based dollar depreciation. But in terms of an overt weak dollar policy, I wouldn't expect that at all.
So no overly weak dollar policy, and he reaffirms in the Journal this morning strong dollar policy. Daragh Maher is the head of Americas for Research and FX Strategy at HSBC. Good morning. Welcome to the show. There's Scott Bessent, before he got the job, talking about the dollar smile. In other words, this quite sort of Nirvana-like scenario where you get inflation coming down, rates coming down, and a market value, a dollar smile. Are you a believer? Are you a buyer of that theory from Bessent?
Yeah, look, yes. Short answer is yes. And I think markets are heartened to have someone, if you like, at the helm of the Treasury who is clearly an advocate for a market-determined exchange rate. And I guess the key, though, is where on that smile are you? I mean, when people think about the dollar smile, they're normally thinking it does well if either the US economy is doing phenomenally well or phenomenally poorly, and if you're in the middle, then other currencies tend to fare better than the dollar. So I think he was anticipating that's where we would be. The reality, though, is that the US economy is doing incredibly well. Rest of the world, not so much so. I mean, it's Thanksgiving week. We're meant to remember our relatives. So Besant has to remember the relative story here, which is the US economy is doing far better than Eurozone, others, et cetera, and I guess more recently, inflation is a little bit sticky. So again, part of that pre-election narrative of declining, slowing inflation, it's not quite landing yet in the US.
Do you think that I mean, he is undoubtedly a fiscal hawk. He talks about his threes. He talks about cutting the deficit by 3%, spurring growth by 3% through deregulation and 3 million barrels of oil. If these are the trifecta of what he's going to base his policy on, Daragh, that has capacity to reintroduce a stronger disinflation narrative 2025.
Absolutely, it does. It does. Now, then the question becomes delivery, right? I mean,
yes, and I think that takes a couple of years rather than year one.
But look, he'll wake up this morning, and who wouldn't be happy to say, I'm in a job, and the equity market's rallying, the bond market's rallying, and okay, the dollar's a little bit weaker, but it's had a fantastic run for the last month or two. So I think he'd be pretty pleased with the initial reaction, but the key here is delivery, right? And also, how does he reconcile necessarily what he aspires to? Does that always align with what President-elect Trump aspires to in terms of the outcomes of fiscal policy, what it means for taxation, spending, and US activity? I think the thing that would save, if you like, save the story massively would be if the US economy continues to perform well, right? Growth covers a multitude of sins on the fiscal front, and I think that's what they'll be hoping for.
I mean, the business activity the fastest since 2022. The divergence between Europe and the US is becoming more profound with every data point, isn't it? You said if the dollar was an equity investment, you'd recommend a hold right now. Why?
There's a lot in the price, right? I mean, prior to this election, I had a look at a table of, let's say, forecasters of the dollar for a year away, euro-dollar, let's say. We were the most bearish on the street on euro-dollar, and our forecast for 12 months away was 105. And, you know that wasn't nearly bearish enough. So we, like others, have revised up our dollar view for 2025. We've got 99 cents now as our forecast for euro-dollar end of next year. Makes it sound like Walmart, doesn't it? Get it for 99 cents. But that's where we're at, and I think that makes sense. But right now, we've moved from 112 to 105. I think, and there's a lot in the price by way of ECB easing. We've taken a lot out of the price by way of Fed easing. So, just relax, enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, chill, it's a hold.
It's a hold for now. In terms of the Fed, it's interesting, Besant is an advocate of this shadow Fed, this shadow lead at the Fed maybe being put in there. How disruptive would that be if that's something that is pursued by Trump and Besant? It could be, and it was speculated to be Kevin Warsh last week. He would go to Treasury, and then he would morph into the Fed. How disruptive would that be if there was this shadow quasi lead at the Fed implemented? Well,
Donald Trump has made it clear he thinks there should be a voice, or that at least there should be awareness of what the government might think should happen on monetary policy. In a way, we've had this before. In the first presidency, President Trump at the time did like to talk down rates, did like to criticize Jay Powell, he did like to talk down the dollar, right? So this would be kind of version 2.0. Now, we did some analysis on this, and what we found out was if we looked at euro-dollar in the 30 minutes after a Trump tweet, it moved only fractionally. And in fact, if you looked at how the dollar moved or euro-dollar moved in 30 minutes after CPI, non-farm payrolls, more than double the impact. So there is an impact, right? So these tweets and these observations from the White House do have an adverse impact on the dollar, but they're completely overshadowed by what the economic data is. And at the end of the day, that's what the Fed will tell us. It comes down to the data, and I think they'll brush aside, if you like, if there is political influence, they'll be well capable of navigating their way around that, if you like.
It's good to know there's empirical research on
who does there. I mean, it's amazing.
No, yeah, you're right. In the first sort of 30 minutes after a tweet, and then the longer road. Let's just round off with the ECB. I mean, we made the 2022 lows on the back of the PMIs. Our PMIs are so much stronger. As I say, that divergence trade is very, very clear. How do you rate the possibility of the ECB being so defensive they would go for 50 basis points in December? Or is that just market hype?
Yeah, markets are just greedy, I think. I mean, like, that's... So we need this idea of excitement. Now, I think there's some doves on the ECB that would love that. Panetta, Storneras, maybe would advocate for 50, get rates to neutral and below quickly. But there's a big centre ground that is, oh, let's go 25, 25, 25. And there's still some hawks who will say service sector inflation still pretty punchy, right? And wages growth still, although backward looking, still pretty punchy. So no, I think we're stuck on a 25 trajectory, which again brings me back to this idea that we're in a hold for the dollar because we're kind of priced for or flirting with exciting outcomes. 50 from the ECB, nothing from the Fed in December. And they're flirtations I don't think will be delivered on, which it's just going to be a nice, boring run into the end of the year. Famous last words, you can use that in a clip at some point in the future, but there we go, a boring run into the end of the year.
We'll end up with the likelihood of another jumbo cut, it seems pretty low, but we'll cut that one up. We'll put it out on Twitter today, and we'll see what response we get from Eurodollar on the back of that. Daragh, thank you very much. That's Daragh Maher at HSBC. Coming up on the show, President-elect Trump's hunt for his cabinet members. It comes to an end. More on the story. That's next on Bloomberg. It is your Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manus Cranny here in New York. President-elect Donald Trump's nomination of Brooke Rowlands for Agriculture Secretary marks the end of a process of selecting his administration's top cabinet picks. Now, the pick that stands out from the rest, it's undoubtedly the Treasury Secretary, which finally went to the Key Square Capital founder and CEO, Scott Bessent. Joining me now for a closer look at the hedge fund manager is Bloomberg's Megan Crane in Washington. Megan, good morning to you. The markets have responded positively. Stocks, bonds, the dollar's dipped a little bit. And I think this has a lot to do with the credibility on the delivery of policy in the seat of Treasury. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I think the markets are responding to the fact that Bessent is a known quantity. He's and also a student of economic history who, is believed to be possibly a moderating force on Trump's efforts to really shake things up. He's big on growth and growing our way out of deficits. He's certainly supporting the tax cuts that the president has been talking about for quite some time.
The question that goes through mine is, of course, what happens to Kevin Walsh now? There was a lot of discussion about the game of chess, that Walsh would go to Treasury, Bessent would go to the NEC for a period of time, and then change. But it raises other questions about Elon Musk and his reach into some of these political picks and perhaps changes the narrative a little bit.
It does a little bit. I think Elon Musk might be learning a lesson about Donald Trump in that he does not like to be managed. A lot of people in Washington have tried to influence Trump and his decisions over the years, and he doesn't like that to be obvious. And Elon Musk weighing in on choices, regardless of who he is, and the richest man in the world, he's still, the president-elect is the president-elect, and he is going to make the choices that he prefers. And even Elon Musk is going to learn that probably many times. Also, I think that, Walsh has made it clear he wants to be a part of the Fed, the Fed chairman. And that is, certainly a possibility in the coming years. So maybe that's something that, he put on the table as well. The 40 chess is a little complicated, mostly because, Trump isn't always looking so long term. No,
and we know that favor can come and go quite quickly. Look, a lot of this is going to come down to the approval process. There was a salutary lesson in the Gates debacle last week, stepping out of the process. Talk to me about Tulsi Gabbard. How likely is she to get approval?
Well, so Matt Gaetz sort of stepping off the stage does turn a lot of attention back to Tulsi Gabbard, who is under scrutiny, I think, importantly, not for her personal life, but for her professional choices. And, meeting with the president of Syria, her comments sympathetic to Russia over the years, I think will really intensify scrutiny of her and her history. Whether she gets through or not is, anyone's guess at this point. But she does seem to be definitely under a microscope for some very questionable to the senators positions, and they are not her personal life. They are professional decisions that she made as a member of Congress, and I think that is going to be a pretty difficult nomination process. Certainly, a deep examination of her record.
And then this goes to the heart of this incoming administration not having signed off all the necessary paperwork for some of the background checks and the FBI background checks, and that seems to be quite a contentious issue. There's still no sign-off on that process yet, is there?
That's right. They're still have not moved forward in that regard. The Trump administration incoming Trump administration is sort of doing it their own way. And that will raise questions among senators. They take this process very seriously, not only because they want to maintain their power and their influence over who is in the cabinet, but also some of them just truly, believe in the system, believe that we need to know the background of the people who are coming in to lead these huge agencies with massive budgets and really big, a lot of influence on the lives of everyday Americans.
Well, it's certainly being raised by a number of different factions, isn't it? Megan, thank you very much. Megan Crane there in Washington. Let's turn our attention to the Middle East. Israel is close to a ceasefire deal with Hezbollah. That's according to the Israeli ambassador to the US. The proposal, potentially days away. It entails an initial 60-day suspension of hostilities, but still requires the approval from the government. Dan Williams joins us now from Jerusalem. Dan, the details on this potential ceasefire. This is about a movement of troops and about widening the gap between Israel and those Hezbollah forces.
Indeed, and we're going on what has been stated before. I think perhaps despite the optimism, the guarded optimism of a number of Israeli officials and even one US official we spoke to today, it's worth recalling that we've had upbeat predictions before that did not come to pass. And also Hezbollah, Lebanon have yet to respond today to these latest reports. Nevertheless, the messaging from the Israeli and US sides, and these are allies who've been conferring very closely on the Lebanon plans, is that a deal could be in place. And to judge by previous statements on the conditions for such a deal, Israel wants a long delayed, basically a 2006 UN Security Council resolution ending the previous Lebanon war implemented, such as Hezbollah's fighters are driven north of the Litani River, well away from the Israeli border. However, it wants to go beyond that resolution and institute some sort of oversight mechanism involving not just UN peacekeepers, not just the Lebanese military, which is meant to take the place of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, but also potentially the United States and France in monitoring implementation, monitoring any infractions by Hezbollah. And the big rub here is that Israel also wants to retain the right to restart military action against Hezbollah in the event of such infractions. The Lebanese and Hezbollah have not been happy about this demand in the past. We'll see whether it's still part of this proposed deal, it appears to be, and whether Hezbollah and Lebanon have relented.
Well, where are we in terms of the pressure domestically? I'm just looking at the latest. Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, warns Netanyahu against this. It would be a historic missed opportunity to eradicate Hezbollah. So where is the political landscape domestically in Israel? Is it pro-ceasefire, or is this an outlier faction?
Well, it's worth remembering that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has a fairly broad right of centre and far right coalition government. The man you mentioned is a far right member, and he has in the past come out against ceasefires, what he would see as basically depriving Israel of what he would call a total victory. However, it's worth recalling that in recent weeks, Netanyahu expanded the coalition government with more centrist members who presumably would buttress him against any potential walkout by the far rightists. So I don't think there's any problem in terms of Netanyahu's ability to deliver a deal. I think the big question mark here, as I said, is whether Hezbollah has relented on this Israeli condition of being able to retain the right to resume fighting should there be a perceived Hezbollah infraction. Also, it's worth recalling that in the past, at least, Hezbollah has linked any Lebanon truce to a truce in the Gaza Strip. Such a truce is very elusive. in Gaza, a different front where Israel is also fighting an Iranian proxy in the form of Hamas. It would appear potentially that Hezbollah has abandoned that, in which case we would be coming closer. But as of today, there is still firing across the border in both directions. Yesterday saw more Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon, some 250 missile launches by Hezbollah into Israel. So it would appear that as long as there is not a deal in place, the fighting is going on apace.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much. Dan Williams there with the very latest on the potential for a ceasefire. Back to Wall Street. We've more than 95% done with this earnings season, and the last big consumer earnings are going to hit the tape from the retailer side. Bath and Body Works this morning, and Macy's on Tuesday. Joining us now is Dasha Afanasieva. Dasha, we're heading into this shopping season. We've been told we've obviously 5 less shopping days this year to get our goodies in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So that's going to have an impact. But the consumer remains strong. These retail earnings, however, they affirm this bifurcation.
That's right. I think we can look to Walmart and Target for some really interesting insights on how the consumer's doing. Walmart's increased its outlook, whilst Target's actually experiencing quite sluggish growth. But both agree that the consumer is actually resilient. So Target, the chief commercial officer, Rick Gomez, was saying that consumers remain pressured, but that they're still resilient, and that they're shopping around, and they're really looking for those sales and willing to search across multiple retailers to find those sales items, which of course makes it really, really challenging for retailers hoping for any kind of loyalty from consumers. Similarly, Walmart talk about the consumer being resilient, but their Walmart has reached out for the higher income consumer that's trading down, looking for those bargains, and therefore has had a much stronger outlook. They say that they've seen higher engagement with cohorts with upper income households, accounting for the majority of their share gains. So even though the consumer's resilient, it's this really tough, really competitive bargain hunting environment that we've seen for several quarters now, and that no doubt will play into Macy's results, into Kohl's, and into Bath and Body Works.
Okay, well, certainly our inboxes are full, our phones are pinging with offers for Black Friday, and certainly we've got 5 less days, 27 days, I think, shopping for Christmas and Thanksgiving than we had last year. Dasha, thank you very much. Dasha Afanasieva on the retail track. Coming up in the show, we'll set you up for the agenda. Key data ahead of a short week. It is Thanksgiving week this week. We'll run you through the slate in just a moment. Your week ahead looks a little bit like this. FOMC minutes are released at 2 p.m. tomorrow on Tuesday, followed by the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, PCE. That will hit the tape on Wednesday. U.S. markets are closed on Thursday for Thanksgiving holiday, so liquidity is going to be a little bit thinner. Some key movers for you to keep an eye on. EQT, we broke this news a little bit earlier in the show, agreeing a $3.5 billion financing deal with EQT. That is according to the FT. So Blackstone agrees to do a JV. This is for the interstate pipelines with EQT. Surveillance is up next. They'll take you through the rest of the news flow.